Everybody, take two. Hey, when it doesn't work, you keep trying again, right?
Right.
Um, that I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what happened. My laptop just froze, and then I reset it, and then you were on for a while, and then you were shut out. But I think you thought you were still on. So,
Yeah. I probably had a 20-minute conversation with myself.
hey, before we get back into it, and I don't. Let's just take it from the top. Let's pretend like that didn't even happen. Okay. Um, that you are a native Chicagoan, I believe, if I remember right. You're muted now.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
All
yes.
right. Yeah, that's this thing.
Take three. Take three.
Take three. That's what happens when you got free stuff. It don't work good.
You got to stop buying out of people's trunks on Madison Avenue.
It's two for
So
a dollar, man.
you're native Chicago, I believe, if I remember right, Rogers Park neighborhood, which
Yeah.
is the northeast side of the city.
Yeah.
Very diverse community, both racially but also economically, right?
Yeah.
Um, what high school you went to? I forget.
For a time, I went to Sullivan High School, Roger
Okay.
C. Sullivan High School on the north side. I
Okay.
didn't finish there, but that's where I started. So I guess that's what I claim.
That's right. If you was it right that you dropped out or you moved or
Well, I didn't drop out. I got kicked out. They just asked me politely not to come back, I guess. Not because I was causing problems, just because I didn't show up. And
yeah,
attendance is tethered to dollars, so you got to come or you lose your seat.
yeah. But you got your life right.
I did. I did. A little
Uh-huh,
grit, determination.
uh-huh,
Figured
uh-huh.
it out.
Finished high school, went off to college. Now what are you doing?
I'm an attorney now. But it's been a road here. I had to, go get my GED, junior college, because I didn't have, any sort of grades to get into a university, and then, on the university and law school. But I went add in some time for the Marine Corps, because that's kind of what helped me get
Mhm.
that discipline in order to come back and do that. Because I mean, to be honest, school isn't for everybody right away, right? You got to grow into it. It's got to be your time.
Yeah, for sure, man. Man, it's good to see what God has done, right? He takes us all on different paths. Some take the detours along the way, and yeah, God kept you on track and brought you back, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
thank
I,
you for that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Hey man, so the topic today, we're doing a series kind of talking about home ownership, the importance, the significance of home ownership, and to understand what happens today, we have to go back. I love history because to me, if we don't understand our history, we're going to make the same mistakes. We're not going to understand what the root problems are, so forth. So what we have to start asking questions of what causes the disparities that we see today, right? And specifically with home ownership is in the city of Chicago. I believe the numbers are something like white people 60 to 70% own homes, and I think the numbers around African Americans are probably around 20% or somewhere in there. Um, it's just there's a huge disparity there, and that's across the country as well. And so, what I want to talk about today is something called the Homestead Act of 1863. And this was something I don't remember studying about it in school. I don't know if you did. Maybe you got that. Um, but probably the last few years, I started hearing about this Homestead Act, and my wife even told me, some of her ancestors, had a homestead in northern Wisconsin and so forth. And but man, what explain about the Homestead Act? What in a nutshell is it?
Uh, in a nutshell, the Homestead Act was legislation that was passed by the Senate after the South seceded from the Union. That's important, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
Mhm.
But it basically gave away. The idea was to give away acres of land to folks if you checked a couple of boxes. So you're talking about, I mean, what was it? 270 million acres in total were given away to American folks.
10% of the country's land, right? So, I mean, just to think about that, that's the state of Texas and California, right? The government gave away.
Right, right. And all you had to do was you had to build on the land, you had to like improve it, right? So build your homestead, farm the land. And then at the end of a 5-year term, you had to pay a filing fee. It's like $18. And
Mhm,
you'd be given the deed to the land. Basically, it's the
mhm.
certificate saying that I am a land owner.
Yeah, $18, which today is might be a few hundred, right?
Right.
I don't know exactly how that plays out, but still, you get. I don't know if you mentioned how big this land is, right? But 160 acres, which I grew up in Humboldt Park, Chicago, right? Like nobody says, "Hey, I got an acre of land or whatever." So, what's an acre? But a football. If you take a football field, right? The Super Bowl was just a week ago. From one end of the end zone across the 50 to the 20 of the other side, that's pretty much 1 acre, right? So we're talking about what 120 or so football fields, likely um, lined up. You get that for $18, right? As long
Right.
as you say I'll take care of it, right?
Right. Right.
Now what? Okay, now where did this land come from? I guess is another question, right? And why was the government giving it away for free?
Right. Well, I can tell you the land didn't the land came from everywhere else in this country. Land came from it was taken from underneath the natives, right? Um, but through various acts of aggression and us purchasing the Louisiana purchase and buying that land from the French who had taken it from natives on their own, right? The United States became this massive, vast, expansive land that in order for economic development, you push west and you allow for the country to start to maximize its potential utilizing its natural resources.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, yeah, no land, as you said, is really free, right? There were people who were here for generations before Europeans came, before Africans were brought over, so forth, and yeah, so America continued to want to expand west, right? And so in the natives were pushed further west, right? And now America, the government, the federal government, realized that we need people to live on this land, otherwise natives will just move back in, right? And it's not being utilized and so forth. So how do we get people to move west where it could be more dangerous, right? And you could be more lonely and so forth, right? You don't have many people, and so the idea again, right? Let's give it away for free, and again encourage people to farm it, and that's why America became, especially the Midwest, right? It became known as like the breadbasket of the world. More farmland than anywhere else in the world, and then that spurs on an economy, right? Because now you need equipment to work the land, right? And so industrial revolution is spurred on as a result of that, right? So it kind of kickstarts the economy. Um, Now I want to add that not everyone who inherited the land was able to keep it, because again that's a lot of land, 160 acres to care for, and there are people who just realized, I just can't run this, and so the government took it back, or they ended up selling it
Right.
to either speculators or to the railroad or other mining companies or whatever. And just made whatever profit they could off of it, So, I saw a number, 60% of the families that committed to take this land had it revoked, had to take it back,
Right.
Um, 40% were able to keep it and capitalize off it, but still, that's 40% is 1.6 million people still, right?
Right. Right.
And so 1.6 million people is half of the city of Chicago, right? And back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the population of the country might have been close to 100 million, 80 to 100 million or so. So we're talking about a significant amount of people,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Now, in your mind, what does that do for a family that now has 160 acres of land that they could farm and maybe even parcel off and have their family build homes on it as well. What does that do long term? Because I mean, again, we're talking about something 150 years ago, almost 200 years ago, right? What is the big deal about it today? Why are we talking about it in 2021?
I mean, you think about being gifted that land, you're planting seeds of wealth that are going to be generational. So what you're doing is you're setting your future up, your offspring and their offspring, with this foundation that, quite frankly, will allow other opportunities to present themselves and make people better, have people better situated to move on other opportunities as they present themselves.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just imagine again, you have 10 children like people had back in the day, right? And
Right.
you're able to give each of your children possibly part of the land, right? Or you're able to at least hand off the family farm now to the oldest child, right?
Right.
Um, like again, that passes on generation to generation. That wealth is passed on and created, right? So I recently did some in the past few years. I did some family genealogy on my end. So my mom's side is Puerto Rican and white. My father's side is all white. And as a white person, you always get a little concerned, like when you start looking back in your family closet, like
Am I
do
gonna
we
find
have,
any hoods in there?
do we have any hoods or slave owners, right? And,
Right.
um, thankfully, my family, my patriarchal line stayed in the north, right? So, but I was able to go back to my seven-time great grandfather, Joseph Dye, who fought in the American Revolutionary War. He was from Maryland. And after the war was over, he and others who fought in the war were given 50 acres of land, for very cheap. It wasn't free, but it was very cheap, in Western Maryland, when they were trying to expand west back in the 1780s or so, right?
Right.
And his son then moved to Ohio, further west, bought land in Ohio, probably off of proceeds that his father had,
Right.
right? And I realized like he was one of the first settlers in what is now Columbus, Ohio, and then his son became a settler in northern Indiana, which in what is now Valparaiso. He was one of the first settlers there, right? And so from generation to generation, right, this wealth is passed on. I don't think they were like super wealthy, but you had enough wealth where you could buy land and work it and so forth.
Right.
Now somewhere that money lost its way.
It skipped a generation.
It skipped a few generations. I don't know. Someone became an alcoholic and drank it all away or something. Um, but yeah, again, it passed down for at least 3 or 4 generations, and that was before the Homestead Act, right? So
Right.
now we're talking about not just 50 acres, but we're talking about 160 acres, right, of land. It's impossible to imagine, that didn't help people get a jump start on the race of life, right?
Absolutely.
While African Americans, right, are still picking cotton or tobacco, and aren't able to own anything to pass on to their descendants, right? And so now, technically, the Homestead Act was open for anybody. Abraham Lincoln announced it in the midst of the Civil War, because the slave states, the southern states, didn't want the Homestead Act because they were concerned if more states are added, they might not have slavery, and then that would tip the balance, and slavery would be outlawed in the whole country, right?
Right.
But again, they seceded. They gave up their rights to vote, and so Abraham Lincoln is like, "Yo, we're gonna do this now, right?" And so all this land was given. Again, people started moving west. Technically, it was supposed to be available for Black people, women as well. Basically, it was any head of household.
Right.
Sorry, head of household. But out of 1.6 million people who benefited from it, approximately 3,500 were Black, or African American. 3,500 out of 1.6 million, right? You might be smarter than I am. I don't know what percentage that is. Is that even 1%?
I
I
did
don't.
not go to number school. It's not what it's not 1%. I think 1% would be like 10,000. So
Yeah,
it's less than a percent. But
yeah.
I mean,
It's a sliver, right?
right,
And obviously the one is when people coming out of slavery, right? It's like they don't have money even for that $18 to pay the fee, right? They don't have money to buy the equipment to farm the land, right? Um, they don't know who to talk to in the government to get this
right,
opportunity, right? They probably weren't even told about the opportunity, right? Many of them couldn't read, the reports in the newspaper announcing this Homestead Act, right? Um, Maybe there were some people who went to the government and local office, right, and said, "I want to apply for the Homestead Act," and were denied because of the color of skin, right? We don't know all the specifics, so forth, but again, only 3,500 of 1.6 million people who benefited from the Homestead Act were African American.
right. You know what's interesting on a couple of things that you just said there. I mean, you mentioned that. Actually, let me start by the quote Abraham Lincoln said that I referenced earlier, just because I think it's so profound. Right? He says that uh, the purpose of the American government is to, elevate the conditions of man, to lift artificial burdens from the shoulders, and to give everyone an unfettered start and fair chance in the race of life. And that's kind of like part of the thinking that underpinned the Homestead Act, and one of the reasons why they wanted to push it through. And he doesn't make any distinctions there on race, and neither did the act. But you referenced something a minute ago that you were able to do a genealogy search, right? And you were able to take it back, what, 7 generations to
Mhm.
the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
I So think about that as just your starting point for understanding where your people come from, right? And the
Mhm.
idea of like and not placing burdens on people's shoulders. You ask folks that are descendant from slaves, like they might be able to narrow it down to a plantation based on books, names in a ledger, but they can't tell you what part of Africa they're from. Well, prior to this 23andMe and all that whatnot, but they don't know the folks that are in the direct line. So that's a piece of almost like a generational wealth, like a human capacity wealth that doesn't exist. And now you've got the Homestead Act, where it's got to be word of mouth, because as you mentioned, folks don't slaves yesterday, they don't know how to read. Most of them, it was against the law for them to know how to read, right?
Mhm.
Word of mouth. I mean, that's why Kansas was one of the places where a large section of Black folks went, because of word of mouth. And this dude John Brown, who was an abolitionist, who was eventually hung for doing his slave raids. But like people, he was kind of revered in the minds of folks who were slaves and are now freed. So I mean, they didn't know anything other than to go to Kansas. They didn't know what they were going to expect. Like how to manage land, how to, what do you call it, develop land. So I mean, that doesn't surprise me that only 3,500 African American folks, Black folks, were able to, hang on for the whole 5 years, pay the $18, and be able to establish that pillar of, a framework for their generations to come.
Yeah. And there's one name that most people would recognize who was one of those 3,500, George Washington Carver,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And, obviously that benefited him, but he obviously gave up the land and became a professor in Tuskegee, so forth. But yeah, again, 3,500. And I want to go back to the Abraham Lincoln quote. Obviously he's the president who initiated the act, the Homestead Act, in 1863. That final phrase, to give everyone an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. So when we have talks today in 2021, 21st century, um, any talks that have to do with reparations, or any talks that have to do with helping people get a hand up, right? Get an opportunity. Obviously, there tends to be a lot of pushback against that, right? There's a lot of, they got to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. We can't do welfare. This again happened 150 plus years ago, so forth. What would you say to that individual?
I mean, that's perspective that lacks historical context at the very least. Um, you have to know before you know where you're going, you got to know where you've been, right? And where Black folks have been has been in a position of second class citizens since since they were in chains. And even when the chains were taken away, there was still uh, what's it called? Reconstruction ended 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes took the federal troops out of the South that were supposed to make sure the Southerners, the formerly seceded states, the defeated Confederate states, were playing by the rules, and they were allowing Black folks to be incorporated into society and avail themselves of the rights that they would have as being Americans. But when those federal troops left, the Southern states were able to say, you know what, you know, we're not being forced to give folks that we don't believe are equal the rights that they are entitled to under law. So they can't enslave them anymore because that's illegal. The 15th Amendment precludes that. But what you can do is come up with other ways. They call it eventually became like slavery by another name and would develop into what we know as Jim Crow. That's separate but equal. Now mixing of the races. But I mean, part of these black codes that were laws that Southern towns and Southern folks would put on the books were like vagrancy laws, for example. The vagrancy law is written without an eye toward color, but we know how it ends up. The law says that if you are an adult male and you are without a job on the streets during these hours, you are a vagrant, right? And you can therefore be arrested. And who's going to fit that description? Well, probably recently freed slaves who have no other skills, who aren't able to read, who are trying to do what they can to make ends meet. They get picked up and they get locked up, and you don't meet bail because that's always kind of been a tool to keep folks in jail, make bail hard for people to get. And now these slave owners who used to have free labor saw their slaves free. They still need labor though, right? Well, now convict leasing comes into play. And that's when, folks who would be locked up for vagrancy for not having a job because they were they were recently freed slaves, are now locked up and then given to plantation owners to be put right back in the very fields they were just freed from as punishment this time. Now, if you think about what that looks like, somebody who was free today, locked up and put in a field tomorrow, the same field they were just freed from. And they're no longer the slave owner's property at this point. Now you think about you buy a brand new pair of shoes. You're gonna tread carefully to make sure you don't scuff them up, right? And nobody washes a rental car ever. They drive it till the wheels fall off. And that's exactly what they would do with these convicts, former slaves that are now working the fields. But you think about all of these circumstances existing, right? This toxic environment that exists for folks that, a lot of them were able to escape because of the Homestead Act, mind you. I mean, that's a reason. That's yes, free land, but I can go somewhere where I'm not going to be treated like a second class citizen, mostly because ain't nobody else around, because 160 acres in any direction is a lot of space, right? But that it's Abraham Lincoln talking about putting everybody at the equal starting place for the race of life. And people, this discussion, equal opportunity. You got your own bootstraps. Pull yourself out by your bootstraps. But if your boots ain't got straps, then what are people supposed to pull themselves up on? And that's just kind of this fallacy, this idea that equal opportunity should equate to an equal result. And just because people of color in this country in 2021 aren't forced into convict leasing, just because they have the same access to education doesn't mean it's equal education. I mean, everybody who goes to school in Chicago public schools has a friend that goes to school out in the suburbs, and they had a whole different ball game out there. They look like college campuses compared to what we experience in the city schools. That's a disadvantage. You don't think these disadvantages add up? Not only just those that happened over time, but those that happened during the course of one's life. Less than stellar school, less than stellar upbringing, which is influenced by the fact that nobody in your family had any generational wealth. And now it limits your opportunities. It limits your view of the landscape. And you might be running the same track as everybody else, but they done lapped you a couple times.
And let's go to that race analogy, right? So if the race of life is a marathon, 26.2 miles, right? This would be like white people, specifically white men, I would say, right? Were able to run 13 miles and then the black people, right, are told, okay, you guys could start running now, right?
Right.
Um, and yet they have no idea the map where this path goes, right?
The rules of the road.
They have no idea, right? The rules of the road. They have no
Right.
idea if they could. Can they stop and take a rest break? Can they get a drink? Can they, um, use the restroom and and then there's people along the way with bats, right? Who are beating them, right? It's like
Kneecapping folks.
Jim Crow laws, right? Um, and then the race is over. The white people, the white men, finished it hours ago, and now here come, a few black people and trickling in, so forth, right? I mean, that's kind of, helps me to think through again. We can't be mad at the end result when the beginning point wasn't the same, right?
Right.
Um,
And it takes
and, and,
time to close
and
that
so,
gap.
yeah. And
You
so
know?
going back to equality versus equity, right? Equity is what we want, right? Um, is, well, okay, if we're in the midst of this race now, then we need to drive the certain population to catch up with the other population, right?
Right.
Now let them go at it, after they know the rules and after they're prepared for it and so forth. And now that's equality. That's true equality, right? Now everybody has again an equal opportunity. Um, so man, this is a good discussion. We're gonna continue this talk. Hopefully, if you allow me to, I would love to next week. There's the promise of the 40 acres and a mule, right? That's often quoted, and I think even isn't it Spike Lee's like movie company? Isn't it called like 40 Acres and a Mule? Um,
I don't know.
I could be
Sounds right
wrong.
though. I
Yeah,
mean, you
sounds
could be
right.
right though. I wouldn't know, man.
I would love to talk about that. I would love to talk about the after World War II, the GI Bill. Which
Absolutely.
helped a number of families buy homes and get college education and so forth at an affordable rate. And then redlining. I mean, again, let's march our way down from again Civil War at least, right? And until modern history, right? And talk about again how this race of life hasn't been always the most fair for everybody, most equal, most equitable, right?
Right.
Um, man, any final thoughts you have?
You know, I final thoughts being, I think the overarching idea that that you had when you asked me to come sit down and have some chats with you, I think is brilliant. I think that the notion that folks really have to understand how some of these things have an impact on today. Nothing we see today happened in a vacuum, and I appreciate you having the foresight to kind of make this a thing. I think there's a lot
Yeah,
of value to it.
yeah. I know our organization, Legacy Disciple, we want to help families, specifically in Chicago, on the west side and south side of Chicago, where there's more violence and poverty and brokenness. We want to help families buy homes because we know that again, homes don't just change it for our generation, home ownership, right? But it changes for future generations as well. One thing we didn't talk about as well, which I'll just end on here, is it's not just about the finances with home ownership, right? But when you own the land, when you are now a stakeholder in that community, now people look to you, they listen to you, you have a voice, right? You
Mhm.
make laws, for that society. You dictate, you know what water the community is going to drink, right? You dictate where the streets are going to go, right? You dictate whether there's street lights. You dictate, the police, and how they're going to serve the community, right? You dictate, who else could build here and who can't build here, right? There's so much power dynamics in addition to just the financial aspect, right? And maybe in the coming weeks we could address that a little bit as well. I just want to read one scripture, Proverbs 19:14. House and wealth are inherited from fathers. This is, Proverbs are wisdom sayings from King Solomon, right? Who didn't always get everything right in life, but even through his mistakes, he gained a lot of wisdom. And again, the idea here is that property and wealth is to be passed on from generation to generation. And again, we want to be people who don't just live for ourselves, but who live for those coming behind us. So how can we help our children? How can we help our neighbors, our community rise up together so that it's not one of us running ahead. It's not one of us kicking the other person to the ground, right?
Right.
But it's us running together to the finish line. So, Adet, thank you for joining me in today's discussion on the Legacy Disciple podcast. Looking forward to the future conversations.
I appreciate